In Oxford's rain-darkened quadrangles, where 8 centuries of secrets sleep beneath scholarly civility, Inspector Morse discovers that a missing classicist, an unfinished crossword, and a decades-old forgery scandal have converged in the most elegant of murders, one committed with poison, poetry, and the patient cruelty of academic revenge. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps in a quiet study surrounded by books that suddenly seem to hold more secrets than you realized, or walking through streets where the most civilized facades might conceal the darkest truths. There is something particularly desolate about Oxford in November, when the last tourists have fled and the undergraduates retreat into their rooms for the grim ritual of reading week. The ancient stones seem to exhale the accumulated sighs of 8 centuries, and even the most familiar quadrangles take on the quality of abandoned theaters, their stages swept clean but somehow still resonating with echoes of vanished performances. I found myself walking through such emptiness on a Tuesday evening, the rain falling with that peculiar English persistence that transforms mere weather into a form of philosophical inquiry. I had no particular business in St. Bartholomew's College, merely the restlessness that sometimes seized me when a case had concluded and the machinery of justice ground forward without requiring my further attention. The rain drummed against the diamond-paned windows of the Porter's Lodge, where Albert Grimsby sat reading what appeared to be a biography of Gladstone, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose like a bookmark in the story of his own long tenure. We had known each other for the better part of 2 decades, since my own undergraduate days when he had been merely the underporter, and our conversation followed the comfortable patterns of institutional memory. The weather, naturally. The declining standards of modern students, a perennial lament that I suspected had been voiced in these same corridors since the 14th century. The way the college cat had taken to sleeping in the chapel pews during evensong, causing mild scandal among the more traditional fellows. It was Grimsby who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the curious absence of Dr. Helena Ashworth. She had been expected for her morning lecture on Augustan poetry, he explained, adjusting his spectacles with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life attending to details others overlooked. The students had waited the customary 15 minutes before dispersing with that particular mixture of disappointment and relief that characterizes academic life. Inquiries at her rooms had yielded no response, though her post remained uncollected and her car sat undisturbed in the fellows' parking area. This might have been unremarkable. Academics are not immune to the common frailties of oversleeping or sudden illness, except that Dr. Ashworth was known for a kind of scholarly punctuality that bordered on the ritualistic. She had been at St. Bartholomew's for only a term, a visiting fellow from Cambridge working on some research project that required access to the college's medieval manuscripts, but already she had established herself as someone upon whom others could depend. Her absence felt like a missed note in a familiar piece of music, barely perceptible but somehow wrong. Grimsby's concern was mild but persistent, the sort of institutional worry that develops when familiar patterns are disrupted without explanation. He had checked her rooms again that afternoon and found them empty, though her belongings remained undisturbed in a way that suggested temporary rather than permanent departure. It was as though she had simply evaporated from the college's consciousness, leaving behind only the faint impression of her presence and the growing certainty that something was amiss. I found myself offering to make inquiries, though I possessed no official standing in the matter and had no particular reason to involve myself in what might prove to be nothing more than academic absent-mindedness. Perhaps it was the rain, or the weight of approaching winter, or simply the recognition that Dr. Helena Ashworth had become, in her brief absence, more present to my imagination than she had ever been in life. Grimsby provided me with a key to the library, where she had been known to work late into the evening, and I made my way across the darkened quadrangle with the peculiar sense that I was walking toward something that would alter the comfortable patterns of my own existence. The library of St. Bartholomew's occupies the entire ground floor of the college's oldest building, its reading rooms connected by a maze of narrow corridors lined with books that seem to have grown into the very walls over the centuries. The air holds the accumulated breath of generations of scholars, that particular mixture of vellum and dust and the faint sweetness of slowly decomposing paper that transforms mere knowledge into something approaching sanctity. I found her in the rare books room, seated at one of the heavy oak tables as though she had simply fallen asleep over her work. Dr. Helena Ashworth appeared to be a woman of perhaps 45, with greying hair pulled back in a style that suggested both elegance and practicality. She wore a dark wool cardigan over a white blouse, and her hands were folded with unconscious grace beside an open volume of Ovid's Metamorphoses. A pair of reading glasses lay precisely parallel to an unfinished crossword puzzle from that morning's Times, and a teacup sat cooling in its saucer, the liquid within long since grown cold. She had been dead for several hours, though she appeared to have died peacefully, without struggle or obvious distress. Yet something in the arrangement of the scene, the too-perfect positioning of her glasses, the deliberate way the book lay open to a particular passage about transformation and loss, suggested that Dr. Helena Ashworth's final evening had been choreographed by someone other than herself. The rain continued its quiet percussion against the windows, and in that hushed sanctuary of accumulated learning, surrounded by the patient wisdom of centuries, I began to understand that I had stumbled upon something far more complex than a simple academic absence. The crossword puzzle bore several completed answers, but one clue remained tantalizingly blank. The last visitor came without a name, 4. I stared at those empty squares and felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that had defined so much of my professional life, the recognition that beneath the surface of this peaceful scene lay depths that would require all my patience and intuition to fathom. Lewis arrived with that particular mixture of professional concern and personal familiarity that had sustained our partnership through so many years of Oxford's darker mysteries. I heard his footsteps in the corridor before he appeared in the doorway of the rare books room, pausing there as he always did to absorb the scene before disturbing it with official procedure. The morning light had strengthened since my discovery of Dr. Helena Ashworth, casting longer shadows across the oak table where she remained seated in her final scholarly pose, and I found myself grateful for his presence in that hushed sanctuary of accumulated learning. He approached with characteristic efficiency, his trained eye taking in the details I had been contemplating for the better part of an hour. The body showed no signs of struggle, no indication of violence beyond the subtle evidence that death had not arrived naturally. Her hands remained folded beside the open Ovid with unconscious grace, and her expression held the peaceful quality that often accompanies a gentle departure from this world. Yet it was precisely this tranquility that troubled me most deeply, for it suggested a death choreographed with considerable care and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. The medical examiner confirmed what I had begun to suspect during my solitary vigil. Dr. Ashworth had died from digitalis poisoning, the toxin administered through her evening tea with a precision that spoke of both botanical knowledge and careful planning. Lewis examined the teacup with his methodical thoroughness, noting the faint residue that clung to the porcelain like the ghost of foxglove petals. The poison had been masked skillfully, enough honey to sweeten the bitter taste, bergamot oil from Earl Grey to provide additional camouflage for those who understood the delicate chemistry of murder. I found myself studying the arrangement of evidence with increasing fascination. Someone had taken extraordinary care to position each element according to some private aesthetic, creating a tableau that spoke as eloquently as any confession while revealing nothing of its author's identity. The teacup sat precisely, centered on its saucer, the handle aligned with mathematical precision to the book's spine. A small crescent mark on the saucer's rim suggested the cup had been lifted and replaced at least once, though whether by Dr. Ashworth herself or by her killer remained unclear. Her reading glasses presented the most intriguing puzzle. They had been removed after death and placed with deliberate symmetry beside the crossword puzzle, their wire frames catching the morning light like a pair of question marks posed to the empty air. The slight indentations on either side of her nose confirmed she had been wearing them when she died, yet someone had taken the trouble to arrange them with ritualistic care. The gesture seemed both intimate and clinical, suggesting a killer who combined emotional investment with methodical execution. Lewis pointed out that the Ovid lay open to Book 15, where Pythagoras discoursed on transformation and the persistence of identity through death. The passage dealt specifically with metamorphosis as a form of continuity rather than ending, with particular emphasis on how the soul might survive the dissolution of physical form. Someone had ensured these particular verses would be visible to whoever discovered the body, though whether this represented the killer's message or Dr. Ashworth's own final choice remained tantalizingly unclear. The crossword puzzle bore several completed answers in her precise handwriting. Metamorphosis, spanning the central horizontal, transformation running vertically through the middle, identity occupying a strategic corner position. The pattern suggested someone deeply preoccupied with questions of change and permanence, though the final clue remained blank. The last visitor came, without a name, like an accusation waiting for resolution. Most significantly, 3 books that Dr. Ashworth had specifically requested from the library's collection were missing from her table. According to the meticulous records kept by the librarian, she had signed out Suetonius's Lives of the Sizes, Pliny's Natural History, and a 14th-century manuscript catalogue documenting the college's medieval acquisitions. These volumes should have been present alongside the Ovid, yet they had vanished as completely as though they had never existed. Their absence created a deliberate gap in the scholarly narrative of her final evening, a lacuna that seemed designed to frustrate investigation rather than illuminate it. Professor Edmund Hartwell arrived as we were photographing the scene, his appearance in the doorway combining genuine shock with carefully controlled institutional composure. He possessed that distinguished bearing which academic institutions seem to cultivate in their senior members: silver hair precisely trimmed, clothing that managed to appear both expensive and appropriately worn, the understated elegance that speaks of old traditions and older money. His reaction to Dr. Ashworth's death revealed depths of personal loss that he struggled to contain within proper professional boundaries. He spoke of Helena with careful admiration that suggested both intellectual respect and something deeper, describing her as a scholar of extraordinary gifts whose work on lost Roman manuscripts promised to revolutionize classical studies. She possessed that rare combination of linguistic brilliance and historical intuition necessary for manuscript authentication, along with an almost mystical ability to recognize genuine antiquity among the countless forgeries that plagued the antiquities market. Her recent project involved fragments donated to the college by an anonymous benefactor, pieces that might represent lost works by major Roman authors. Hartwell's description of her recent mood suggested growing unease rather than scholarly excitement. She had become increasingly withdrawn over the past several weeks, declining social invitations and spending longer hours in solitude among the library's collections. When I inquired about her personal relationships within the college, his response carried subtle undertones of protective discretion. She had formed friendships with several younger fellows, particularly Dr. James Fenwick in the classics department, though these connections seemed based more on intellectual compatibility than romantic attachment. Her private life remained largely mysterious, Hartwell continued, as she spoke little of Cambridge colleagues or family connections. Her rooms contained few personal photographs or correspondence that might illuminate her background, as though she had deliberately constructed a scholarly identity separate from whatever past she had left behind. This deliberate privacy now seemed ominous in light of her death, suggesting secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. As we prepared to conclude our initial examination, I noticed faint pencil marks along the margin of the Ovid text, though the words remained too smudged to decipher clearly. The inscription appeared recent, possibly made on the evening of Dr. Ashworth's death, yet its meaning remained as elusive as the identity of whoever had arranged her final scholarly tableau with such meticulous and unsettling care. The rain had stopped during our investigation, leaving behind that particular clarity of light that sometimes follows November storms. As Lewis organized the removal of evidence and the body, I found myself increasingly convinced that we were confronting something far more complex than simple murder. The careful arrangement of clues, the missing library books, the symbolic resonance of the chosen Ovid passage all suggested a killer who understood both Helena's academic work and her personal vulnerabilities with unusual intimacy. Yet the very deliberateness of these elements also raised the possibility that we were meant to draw specific conclusions, that the entire scene had been constructed not merely to conceal the truth, but to direct our investigation along predetermined paths. In that hushed sanctuary of accumulated learning, surrounded by centuries of scholarly endeavor, I felt the familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that had defined so much of my professional life. Dr. Helena Ashworth's death represented a puzzle worthy of her own analytical skills, a mystery that would require all my patience and intuition to unravel. The game had begun in earnest, played not with crude weapons, but with the subtle instruments of erudition and calculated deception. Her rooms occupied the second floor of the Georgian wing, their tall windows facing north toward a strip of garden where the ancient yew had learned the discipline of perpetual shadow. I remember the quiet resistance of the key in the lock, that moment of hesitation before entering the private sanctuary of the dead, and then the peculiar hush that follows intrusion when absence becomes, paradoxically, a form of presence. Some rooms announced their occupant's return at any moment. Hers had cultivated an order that suggested its own austere companionship, a space designed not for welcoming others, but for the solitary communion between mind and text. Refinement, that much-abused word, belonged here without apology. A narrow shelf held what I came to think of as a small republic of poets in plain linen bindings, their spines faded by patient sunlight. Horace aligned with Houseman in an unspoken alliance of meter and melancholy. Ovid translated by a scholar whose marginalia spoke of intimate familiarity. Catullus standing like a barely concealed confession. On the opposite wall, a reproduction of Poussin's Et in Arcadia Ego showed shepherds reading a tomb as though it were a love letter rather than a warning. The absence of photographs struck me immediately. Not one personal image to suggest family or friendship, as though Helena had deliberately constructed an identity separate from whatever past she had chosen to leave behind. Yet it was precisely this absence that made the single photograph on her bedside table so significant. A young man bore sufficient resemblance to suggest family connection, though someone had carefully folded the frame's backing to obscure his face, creating a gesture both protective and painful. She could neither bear to look upon this image nor bring herself to discard it entirely, the sort of emotional archaeology that transforms memory into both treasure and torment. Beside it lay a particular edition of Sappho, its cover worn smooth by handling, a single dried rose petal marking a page where the Greek poet wrote of desire and loss. The bedroom revealed similar patterns of refined solitude. Her clothes hung with military precision, each garment chosen for quality rather than fashion, the understated elegance that requires both taste and considerable restraint. A kettle beside the small cooker remained dry, cups stacked with geometric tidiness, a jar of honey polished clean, of any sticky evidence of use. These details accumulated into a portrait of someone who had chosen the company of ancient texts over the messier complexities of human connection. Yet the dried rose petal and the obscured photograph suggested depths of feeling carefully suppressed rather than absent. Lewis discovered the correspondence in the desk's locked drawer, the key hanging on a thin chain around Helena's neck. A detail that had seemed merely personal until it revealed itself as the guardian of secrets. The drawer contained perhaps 24 letters in various stages of completion, all addressed to someone identified only as M, their contents transforming our understanding of the composed scholar we had found in the library. These were not mere professional exchanges, but fragments of a soul laid bare, passionate and conflicted correspondence that revealed intellectual collaboration intertwined with romantic entanglement. The earliest letters, dating from her arrival at St. Bartholomew's, began with scholarly enthusiasm and gentle observations about Oxford's social rituals. Her handwriting flowed across the pages with unconscious grace, each word chosen with the precision of someone accustomed to expressing complex thoughts elegantly. Yet as the correspondence progressed, the tone shifted toward something far more personal and emotionally charged. She wrote of discoveries that excited her beyond mere academic interest, of connections she had made between seemingly disparate historical fragments, of growing certainty that her work might vindicate theories long dismissed by scholarly consensus. One letter began with particular intensity. "My dearest M, the discovery of these fragments has both exhilarated and terrified me. Your insights, as ever, cut to the quick of the matter, but the implications, they threaten to dismantle so much we hold sacred." Another, written in a more agitated hand, revealed deeper currents. "You accuse me of sentimentality, of allowing personal history to cloud academic judgment. But M, how can one separate the scholar from the heart when the truth itself is so deeply personal?" The later correspondence revealed a relationship of profound intellectual intimacy that transcended mere friendship while remaining frustratingly ambiguous about its precise nature. "I find myself reaching for the telephone, M, to share a phrase, a nuance, and then remember the boundaries we have so carefully, so painfully erected," she had written, the words carrying the weight of deliberately constrained passion. Whether this represented romantic love, intellectual obsession, or some more complex combination remained tantalizingly unclear, yet the emotional intensity was unmistakable. Most disturbing were the final letters, which spoke of betrayal and growing fear. Helena had discovered something in the college archives that challenged fundamental assumptions about her research, revelations that implicated people she had trusted and respected. Her handwriting became increasingly agitated as she described the terrible choice between scholarly integrity and personal loyalty, between truth and the destruction it might bring to innocent lives. The last completed letter, dated 3 days before her death, ended with chilling prescience. "I begin to understand that some secrets are worth killing to preserve, and I fear I may have underestimated those who benefit from their concealment." Dr. James Fenwick arrived as I was absorbing these revelations, his appearance in the garden below announced by that particular mixture of academic authority and emotional uncertainty that characterizes many university careers. He was perhaps 35, with an earnest face that struggled to convey the gravitas his position required, his tweed jacket seeming a size too large, as though he were trying to inhabit a role he hadn't quite grown into. When he looked up and saw me at Helena's window, the small start that crossed his features seemed equal parts relief and surprise. Our conversation took place beneath the yew, where fallen needles held droplets like a row of commas, each pause in our dialogue marked by the quiet percussion of water finding earth. He spoke of Helena with reverence that hinted at deeper feelings, describing her as the most brilliant classical scholar he had encountered during his decade at Oxford. Their relationship had been built upon shared intellectual passions and mutual respect. Though he acknowledged harboring emotions, she had neither encouraged nor explicitly discouraged. His eyes lingered on certain objects visible through her window with subtle possessiveness, as though he were committing each detail to memory. When I inquired about her recent research, Fenwick's demeanor shifted toward careful evasion. He confirmed her work with manuscript fragments recently donated to the college, pieces that might represent lost works by major Roman authors, but his earlier enthusiasm dimmed when pressed for specifics. He spoke in generalities about the challenges of authentication, the delicate work of textual analysis, yet offered no concrete details about the content of her discoveries or the progress of her investigation. She was very private about it, he explained, running a hand through already disheveled hair. Said it was too early to discuss, too many variables. You know how these things are in academia. Everyone wants to be first to publish, to claim the discovery. The forced casualness of his tone suggested deliberate omission, knowledge he preferred not to acknowledge. Most significantly, Fenwick mentioned Helena's growing preoccupation with something she had discovered in the college archives. Not directly related to her Roman fragments, but something that had disturbed her profoundly. She was disturbed. That's the word she used, he said, the phrase carrying weight beyond its simple meaning. Something she'd found that cast a long shadow, something that made her question everything. She wouldn't elaborate, just said it was old, a historical anomaly that touched upon a sensitive chapter in the college's past. His claim of ignorance regarding specifics felt genuine enough, yet the very vagueness of his recollection suggested memory deliberately suppressed or knowledge he was unwilling to share. The phrase, cast a long shadow, resonated with the melancholic atmosphere of Helena's rooms, with the quiet ache of her unsent letters implying a revelation of considerable weight that had unsettled a scholar known for unflappable intellectual composure. As afternoon light faded across the quadrangle, I found myself carrying away the image of that dried rose petal in Sappho and the passionate, conflicted voice of the letters to Em. Helena Ashworth, the meticulous classicist and solitary scholar, had harbored a hidden emotional landscape as complex and layered as any ancient text. Her discovery in the college archives, something that disturbed her enough to transform scholarly excitement into mortal fear, had somehow intertwined with that secret life, leading her to the peaceful tableau of death we had found in the library. The threads were beginning to emerge from the tapestry, the mysterious correspondent, the nature of her archival discovery, the identity of whoever had orchestrated her final scene with such meticulous care. Yet like the obscured face in her bedside photograph, the complete picture remained deliberately hidden, protected by layers of academic discretion and calculated deception that would require all my patience and intuition to penetrate. The lane that leads to Vivian Blackwood's shop is the kind Oxford keeps for itself, a narrow channel of damp stone and pale echoes where bicycles lean like parenthetical remarks against ancient railings. The air carries that particular mixture of wet rope and old tobacco that seems to accumulate in places where time moves more slowly than elsewhere, and the cobblestones hold the memory of centuries in their uneven surfaces. Her door announced my arrival with a bell that behaved less like a summons and more like a discreet cough, the sound absorbed immediately by the hushed sanctuary within. The interior drew itself together around polished counters and glass-fronted cabinets, the temperature maintained at that precise degree which preserves vellum while welcoming human contemplation. Light, filtered through leaded windows, fell in gentle pools upon leather-bound volumes whose spines created a palette of browns and golds that spoke of age gracefully accepted. The scent was a civilized quarrel between beeswax and the slow breath of paper, that particular atmosphere which transforms mere commerce into something approaching communion with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Vivian Blackwood emerged from the shop's depths with the fluid grace of someone completely at ease in her chosen domain. She appeared to be a woman of perhaps 50, though she possessed that timeless elegance which renders precise age irrelevant. Silver hair arranged with studied casualness, clothing that managed to appear both expensive and effortlessly worn. Her eyes held the particular intelligence of someone accustomed to evaluating both objects and people with equal precision. And when she spoke, her voice carried those cultured tones that suggest equal comfort discussing Cicero or the morning's weather. She received news of Helena's death with what appeared to be genuine shock, though I noticed how quickly she recovered her professional composure. They had worked together for several months on the authentication of manuscript fragments, she explained, describing Helena as a scholar of exceptional gifts whose loss would be deeply felt throughout the academic community. Her words carried appropriate gravity, yet something in her manner suggested carefully rehearsed responses rather than spontaneous grief. The manuscript fragments themselves represented a potentially significant discovery, according to Vivian's account. They had been acquired from a private European collection whose owner preferred anonymity. Pieces that might represent lost works by major Roman authors, including fragments of what could be previously unknown correspondence. Helena's authentication work had been proceeding methodically and without incident, she insisted, though the process required considerable time given the complexity of establishing provenance for such potentially valuable discoveries. Her hands rested lightly on a vellum-bound folio as she spoke, and I found myself watching the way her ring, a plain band of platinum, caught light without advertising it, the gesture familiar to anyone who has spent years among valuable things. She spoke of Helena with informed fondness, as though the scholar had been both client and protégé, describing her methodology with the kind of detailed appreciation that suggested intimate collaboration rather than mere commercial relationship. Yet when I mentioned the 3 missing library books from Helena's final evening, the Suetonius, the Pliny, and the medieval manuscript catalogue, Vivian's reaction revealed depths of knowledge that seemed inconsistent with her claimed role as mere dealer. Her hands ceased their small rearrangements, and the air seemed to grow perceptibly colder, as though a window had opened behind the shelves. "Missing," she said, the word too clean, too promptly polished. Her defensive response carried undertones of personal investment that extended far beyond commercial interest, and her immediate recognition of these specific titles suggested familiarity with Helena's research methods that seemed unusually detailed for someone supposedly outside the authentication process. Any scholar could reconstruct the catalogue's list from the Registrum Bartholomei, she added too quickly, and Suetonius in the Aldine is hardly a rarity here. It was the specificity that turned the key. I had not mentioned the Aldine edition, nor the Latin nickname of the catalogue. She had reached for titles like a woman reaching for familiar gloves, and one of them had fit a little too well. When she attempted to quote Ovid, "The tale is of you when the name is changed," I heard the small bell of my own education ring once and stop. Mutato nomine de te fabula narratur. Horace, not Ovid. A dealer among poets would know, or should. Misquotation is not in itself a crime, but it is a habit, and habits have their genealogies. Her shop's back room, which she showed me with obvious pride, contained what amounted to a private library of reference works that rivaled many university collections. Here were the sophisticated tools of manuscript authentication, microscopes for examining ink and parchment, chemical testing equipment for analyzing binding materials, extensive files documenting the provenance of countless historical documents. The operation went far beyond simple buying and selling, suggesting someone who participated actively in the scholarly process, rather than merely facilitating it. A ledger lay half open on a side table, the kind of thick, green-ruled book that resists closing like a patient whose lungs have learned to love air. I looked, because looking is what years have taught me to do, when people ask me to look elsewhere. Entries in tidy italic listed collections described by initials rather than names. SB/RC, SB/PH. The pattern found its own voice, SB for Saint. Bartholomew's, followed by what appeared to be departmental codes. One line carried particular significance, SB/RB14, with the word delivered noted in the margin beside a date that matched the afternoon of Helena's death. When I inquired about Helena's recent mood and behavior, Vivian's response carried subtle undertones of protective concern that seemed inconsistent with a purely commercial relationship. She described Helena as increasingly withdrawn over the past several weeks, mentioning her growing obsession with some historical detail that seemed to cast doubt on fundamental assumptions. She had become disturbed by something, Vivian explained, her choice of words suggesting intimate knowledge of Helena's psychological state. Something she'd discovered that made her question everything. Her knowledge of Helena's private research extended far beyond what any dealer should possess. She spoke of specific linguistic analyses, tentative conclusions about scribal identity, even Helena's theories regarding deliberate textual alterations. She believed someone had deliberately obscured the true origin of these fragments. Vivian continued with scholarly passion that seemed to mirror Helena's own, perhaps even forged aspects of their history. A very dangerous path for a scholar to tread, Inspector. Exposing a forgery can bring down reputations, even entire careers. As I prepared to leave, that persistent crossword clue from Helena's unfinished puzzle returned to haunt my thoughts with renewed intensity. Scholar's final transformation, 9. The word transformation carried particular resonance in the context of manuscript authentication, where scholars routinely transformed fragmentary evidence into comprehensive historical narratives. Yet Helena's final puzzle seemed to suggest something more personal, a transformation that involved not merely academic discovery, but fundamental changes in identity or understanding. Walking back through Oxford's narrow streets as evening approached, I found myself carrying away the image of that ledger entry and the careful precision with which Vivian had arranged her defensive responses. Her shop represented not merely a place of business, but a nexus where scholarship and commerce intersected, where the past was constantly being bought and sold, authenticated, and sometimes deliberately obscured. The missing library books, Helena's growing obsession with some historical anomaly, the fragments that might or might not represent genuine antiquity, all suggested a complex web of relationships that extended far beyond the elegant confines of Blackwood rare books. The transformation that Helena had contemplated in her final crossword remained as mysterious as the identity of Aim in her unsent letters. Yet I began to suspect these puzzles were connected by threads more complex than mere coincidence. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the accumulated weight of centuries of learning, I felt the familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that had defined so much of my professional life. Vivian Blackwood's unusually intimate knowledge of Helena's work, her defensive reaction to questions about missing books, her misattributed quotation, and that telling ledger entry all suggested depth that would require considerable patience and intuition to fathom. The rain had begun again, a fine persistence that seemed to dissolve the edges of the ancient city, blurring the lines between past and present, between what was known and what remained stubbornly, dangerously hidden. In my pocket, an index card I had discreetly noted from Vivian's ledger, RB14, delivered, carried the promise of connections yet to be explored. Sometimes the smallest details cast the longest shadows, and in the careful world of manuscript dealing, where authenticity and deception dance their eternal waltz, even the most elegant practitioners might find themselves transformed from scholars into something far more dangerous. The Porter's Lodge existed in that peculiar temporal space which only the most established institutions managed to create, where the immediate concerns of daily administration mingle with the accumulated wisdom of decades. I found Albert Grimsby precisely as I'd left him, though the biography of Gladstone had been replaced by that morning's Times, its crossword bearing the careful annotations of someone who approached puzzles with methodical patience. The afternoon light fell through diamond-paned windows onto surfaces polished by years of careful attention, illuminating ledgers whose pages held the quiet chronicles of academic life, and the air carried that particular mixture of strong tea, old newspapers, and the brass polish he applied with almost ritualistic devotion to the fittings of his domain. He looked up with that mild recognition which was neither surprise nor indifference, adjusting his spectacles with the careful precision of someone whose professional life had been built upon observing details others overlooked. We spoke initially of inconsequential matters: the weather's persistence, the declining quality of undergraduate penmanship. Yet beneath these comfortable exchanges lay the deeper current of institutional memory that had drawn me back to his sanctuary. Grimsby possessed that particular form of intelligence which develops in those who spend their careers watching the patterns of human behavior within closed communities, noticing arrivals and departures, recording the subtle changes in routine that might escape more casual observation. His recollection of Helena's recent behavior revealed patterns that had escaped my initial investigation. She had become a creature of increasingly nocturnal habits, arriving at the library well after dinner and remaining until the early hours when even the most dedicated scholars had surrendered to exhaustion. He would see her cross the quadrangle under an umbrella that leaked at the edges, her purposeful stride suggesting someone driven by intellectual urgency rather than mere scholarly routine, the light in the rare books room blooming a minute later as though the library were smiling in recognition. She carried herself differently in recent weeks, he observed, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to reading human behavior like familiar text. Less of that quiet confidence you see in established academics, more of the tension that comes when someone discovers their assumptions have been fundamentally challenged. She'd often bring her own tea, a thermos, though occasionally she'd ask for a fresh cup from the lodge, particularly on colder nights. The detail acquired unsettling significance when he mentioned that Helena had requested fresh tea on the evening of her death, her usual thermos apparently forgotten or deliberately abandoned. She had seemed composed, almost resigned, as though she had reached some difficult decision and was prepared to accept its consequences. Yet something in her manner suggested the kind of distraction that comes when the mind wrestles with profound revelations, the sort of intellectual vertigo that accompanies the discovery that fundamental assumptions have been built upon shifting foundations. More significantly, Grimsby remembered seeing an unfamiliar woman leaving the college grounds through the porter's gate approximately 2 hours after Helena's final entry. The timing created an uncomfortable symmetry with the estimated time of death, yet the visitor's demeanor suggested someone departing a successful meeting rather than fleeing a crime scene. She had been elegantly dressed, moving with the confident stride of someone completely comfortable in academic environments, though he could not recall having seen her during previous visits. Distinguished-looking woman, he continued with characteristic precision. Silver hair, expensive coat, dark, good cloth, the sort of fabric that improves with age. Practical but elegant shoes, a low heel that made no claim to height, yet refused to surrender style. She moved like someone accustomed to having doors open for her, but kept her head down in a way that suggested habit rather than shame. He remembered a scent that followed her like a concluding line, something cool and precise, not flowers, but the ghost of paper and beeswax, the particular atmosphere of someone who spent her professional life among valuable books. The gatebook revealed its own small mysteries. Where a signature should have appeared, someone had made a neat dash, and in the margin an initial that could have been a V or merely an ambitious check mark. The ink for that particular entry was a different black, a fraction warmer, as if the notation had been adjusted after the fact by a pen that had been lately used for correspondence rather than mere record-keeping. Such small disparities whispered of intention, of someone who understood the importance of maintaining official records while obscuring specific identities. Yet it was Grimsby's recollection of Helena's research interests that truly illuminated the deeper currents of her final weeks. She had requested access to the college archives several weeks earlier, specifically files from the 1970s dealing with graduate student records and disciplinary proceedings. The request had been unusual. Visiting fellows typically focused on medieval manuscripts or classical texts rather than recent administrative documents. but Helena's scholarly reputation had ensured cooperation from the archival staff. She was particularly interested in the records of one Martin Ashcroft, Grimsby continued, the name emerging from his memory with careful precision. A graduate student in classics who left Oxford under rather mysterious circumstances in 1973. Brilliant young man, by all accounts, but there were allegations, irregularities in his research that led to his departure before completing his degree. The name struck me with the force of half-remembered recognition, triggering associations that had lain dormant in the deeper recesses of memory. Martin Ashcroft, I had encountered it before in whispered conversations in senior common rooms, the kind of academic controversy that generates passionate debate among scholars while remaining largely invisible to the outside world. The sound carried echoes of old scandal, of a career destroyed by allegations that had never been formally proven but had been sufficient to force his departure from Oxford under circumstances that left his reputation permanently damaged. Grimsby's recollection of the Ashcroft affair was necessarily limited by his junior status at the time, but he retained clear impressions of the controversy's emotional intensity. The allegations had involved manuscript authentication, specifically accusations that Ashcroft had been involved in forging classical documents or misrepresenting their provenance. The academic world, for all its veneer of civility, could be brutally unforgiving when questions arose about scholarly integrity. A forgery scandal was not merely a crime against scholarship, it was a heresy, an affront to the very foundations of intellectual trust. Tragic case, really, Grimsby reflected with the compassion of someone who had witnessed many academic careers rise and fall. Young man with extraordinary linguistic gifts, the sort who might have made significant contributions to classical scholarship. But once those allegations surfaced, his position became impossible. The whispers were widespread, a stain on the otherwise pristine reputation of a brilliant young classicist. The connection between Helena's research and this decades-old scandal began to illuminate aspects of her recent behavior that had previously seemed inexplicable. Her growing withdrawal, her obsession with archival materials, her passionate correspondence with the mysterious AIM, all suggested someone who had uncovered evidence relating to Martin Ashcroft's case and was struggling with its implications. Perhaps she had discovered proof of his innocence, or conversely, evidence that confirmed his guilt in ways that cast new shadows on contemporary scholarship. As afternoon light faded across the quadrangle, I found myself carrying away multiple threads that seemed to converge around Helena's final weeks, the elegant, unfamiliar woman leaving the college grounds with such confident composure. Her timing that coincided so precisely with Helena's death. The decades-old scandal involving manuscript forgery that had destroyed a promising scholar's career. Helena's desperate research into files that Oxford had presumably hoped would remain buried in administrative obscurity. The Martin Ashcroft case represented more than historical curiosity. It was a thread that connected Helena's present research with Oxford's past controversies, creating motives for murder that extended far beyond immediate professional jealousy. In my experience, old scandals rarely remained buried when new evidence surfaced, and the academic world's long memory for scholarly disputes could provide compelling reasons for someone to orchestrate Helena's carefully staged death. Walking back through Oxford's narrow streets as evening approached, I felt the familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that had defined so much of my professional life. The name Martin Ashcroft continued to resonate in my consciousness, carrying associations that would require considerable research to fully explore. Yet I sensed that understanding his story, the nature of the allegations against him, the circumstances of his departure, the evidence Helena had discovered in those 1970s archives, would prove crucial to comprehending the forces that had led to her peaceful tableau of death in the rare books room. The rain had begun again, that fine persistence which seemed to dissolve the edges of the ancient city, blurring the lines between past and present, between justice delayed and justice denied. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the accumulated weight of centuries of learning, I began to understand that Helena's murder represented not merely a crime of passion or professional jealousy, but the violent resolution of conflicts that had been festering in Oxford's scholarly community for more than 2 decades. The crossword clue that had been haunting my thoughts, Scholar's final transformation, seemed to acquire new resonance, suggesting not merely academic metamorphosis, but the kind of fundamental change that comes when buried truths finally surface to demand their due. The morning arrived with that particular Oxford quality of light that seems to have been filtered through centuries of scholarship, pale and contemplative, casting long shadows across quadrangles where the accumulated weight of learning had settled into the very stones. I found myself in the registrar's office, pursuing the kind of administrative archaeology that often proves more revealing than any witness statement, surrounded by filing cabinets that held the quiet chronicles of academic lives, lived and sometimes deliberately obscured. The revelation emerged from documents as mundane as they were devastating. Helena's personnel file, meticulously maintained according to university protocol, contained the standard collection of credentials and references that supported her appointment as visiting fellow. Yet buried among insurance forms and housing applications lay a single sheet that transformed everything I thought I understood about the woman who had died so peacefully in the rare books room. In careful block letters beside her name, she had added a parenthetical notation that seemed almost apologetic in its discretion. Formerly Ashcroft. The surname struck me with the force of recognition deferred, like a half-remembered melody that suddenly resolves into familiar harmony. Helena Margaret Ashcroft, born in Cambridge 37 years earlier, to parents whose academic credentials suggested a family steeped in classical scholarship from the very beginning. The transformation to Ashworth represented more than administrative convenience. It was an act of deliberate reinvention that preserved the initial syllable while creating distance from whatever shame had necessitated such careful concealment. Lewis discovered the crucial connection in matriculation records salvaged from archival storage, his methodical approach yielding the name that had been haunting the edges of my consciousness. Martin Daniel Ashcroft, Classical Mods, 1971, B.Phil candidate, 1972-73. A marginal notation in what appeared to be a tutor's hand provided the epitaph for a promising career. Withdrawn, allegations. The abbreviation carried the weight of institutional euphemism, the careful language universities employ when scandal threatens their carefully maintained reputations. The photograph beside Helena's bed acquired immediate and painful significance. Not merely a brother, but the brother whose disgrace had cast such a long shadow that she had been compelled to abandon even the name that connected them. The dried rose petal in her Sappho, the passionate letters to the mysterious M, the growing obsession with manuscript authentication, all suddenly cohered around this central tragedy, revealing Helena's scholarly career as something far more personal than mere academic pursuit. Martin Ashcroft's file painted the portrait of a scholar whose brilliance had been matched only by the thoroughness of his academic annihilation. He had arrived at Oxford in 1970 with credentials that suggested exceptional promise. First-class honors from Cambridge, linguistic gifts that extended across multiple classical languages, theoretical insights that his supervisors described as revolutionary. His early work on manuscript authentication had earned praise from senior scholars throughout Europe, and his doctoral research promised to establish new methodologies for determining the authenticity of disputed classical texts. The allegations that destroyed him had emerged gradually, like poison seeping through groundwater. Anonymous letters to departmental heads hinted at irregularities in his research practices, suggesting that his authentication methods might have been compromised by personal investment in particular conclusions. Questions were raised about the provenance of certain Roman manuscript fragments he had been studying, with suggestions that his conclusions were suspiciously convenient, too perfectly aligned with his theoretical predictions. The accusations were never formally proven, but in the rarefied atmosphere of academic reputation, suspicion proved sufficient to render his position untenable. Professor Edmund Hartwell received me in his study with the weary resignation of someone who had been expecting this conversation for many years. The room reflected a lifetime spent in service to classical scholarship, its walls lined with familiar editions whose spines created a palette of scholarly browns and golds. When I presented him with the evidence of Helena's true identity, a flicker, not of surprise but of deeply ingrained sorrow, crossed his features. "I knew from the moment she arrived," he admitted with quiet anguish that seemed to have been carefully suppressed for decades. The resemblance was unmistakable to anyone who had known Martin. She was candid about her lineage when she applied for the visiting fellowship, about her belief in her brother's innocence. I saw no reason to refuse her request. Her scholarship was impeccable, and frankly, the old wounds of the Ashcroft affair had never truly healed. His confession revealed layers of institutional politics and personal guilt that had been festering beneath Oxford's civilized surface for more than 20 years. As Martin's supervisor, Hartwell had initially championed his students' revolutionary approaches to manuscript authentication, recognizing in them the potential for significant advances in classical scholarship. Yet when the allegations surfaced, when anonymous accusations began circulating among senior faculty, Hartwell had faced an impossible choice between defending his student and protecting his own reputation. The evidence seemed incontrovertible at the time, he continued, his hands moving restlessly among the papers on his desk. New techniques for dating parchment that revealed anachronisms, linguistic anomalies that suggested deliberate forgery. The committee I served on felt compelled to act on what appeared to be overwhelming evidence, but I never truly believed Martin was a malicious charlatan, misguided perhaps, overzealous in his pursuit of truth, but not deliberately deceptive. The specific allegations had centered on Martin's work with a collection of Roman manuscript fragments that bore striking similarities to the materials Helena had been authenticating at the time of her death. Martin had claimed these fragments represented lost works by major classical authors, using innovative analytical techniques to establish their authenticity and historical significance. Yet other scholars had raised questions about their provenance, suggesting that their discovery had been too convenient, their content too perfectly supportive of Martin's theoretical framework. What emerged from Hartwell's painful recollection was a picture of institutional failure, a young scholar destroyed not by definitive proof of wrongdoing, but by the university's need to protect itself from scandal. The committee's investigation had been thorough in appearance, but compromised by the pressure to reach conclusions that would minimize damage to Oxford's reputation. Martin's departure before the formal hearing that might have cleared his name had been presented as evidence of guilt, though it might equally have represented the despair of someone who recognized that the outcome had already been determined. Helena's research into our archives from the 1970s, Hartwell explained with growing unease, had uncovered inconsistencies in the original documentation. Dates of acquisition that didn't match the physical evidence, expert testimonies that seemed coordinated rather than independent. She believed someone had deliberately orchestrated her brother's destruction, planting evidence and manipulating the investigation to ensure his downfall. The passionate correspondence with M now revealed its true significance, not romantic entanglement, but something far more poignant. A sister's desperate attempt to communicate with a brother whose life had been systematically destroyed. Whether Martin remained alive somewhere, existing under an assumed identity, or whether Helena had been writing to his memory, the letters represented a decades-long quest for vindication that had finally brought her back to the scene of the original injustice. Her growing agitation in recent weeks, her withdrawal from social interaction, her obsession with archival materials, all suggested someone who had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple academic rivalry. The missing library books from her final evening, the carefully staged tableau of her death, the elegant woman leaving the college grounds with such confident composure, all pointed towards someone who understood the profound personal stakes involved in Helena's research and was prepared to kill to prevent the truth from emerging. As evening light faded across the quadrangle, I found myself carrying away the weight of names both hidden and revealed. Helena Ashworth had been Helena Ashcroft, sister to a scholar destroyed by allegations that may have been deliberately fabricated. Her transformation had allowed her to pursue the vindication that had been denied to Martin, yet it had also made her a target for whoever had orchestrated the original conspiracy. The crossword clue that had been haunting my thoughts, Scholar's final transformation, acquired new and ominous resonance, suggesting not merely academic metamorphosis, but the kind of fundamental change that comes when buried truths finally surface to demand their due. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, I began to understand that Helena's murder represented not merely a crime of passion or professional jealousy, but the violent conclusion of a decades-long struggle for justice. The academic world, for all its veneer of civilized discourse, remained intensely human, prone to the same jealousies, ambitions, and desperate measures that drove violence in any other sphere. The scandal of Martin Ashcroft, buried for more than 20 years, had now resurfaced to claim a new victim, leaving behind only the quiet devastation of lives undone and the terrible weight of institutional complicity in the destruction of innocent reputations. Dr. James Fenwick's rooms occupied the third floor of the medieval wing, their narrow windows offering glimpses of the college chapel's spire through diamond panes that had witnessed centuries of scholarly ambition and disappointment. The afternoon light fell with particular intensity across surfaces that revealed, upon closer examination, something far more complex than the accumulated treasures of patient scholarship. What I had initially taken for the natural evolution of an academic library proved, under more careful scrutiny, to be a collection assembled with both passion and recent, almost desperate urgency. The first impression was of brown, a civilization of bindings and foxed calf and dull morocco, rising in terraces to the picture rail, creating geological arrangements where strata of text formed cliffs around the furniture. Yet beneath this scholarly patina lay the glitter of the new among the venerable, a brightness at the edges of spines that had not yet earned their dust. The scent carried that particular mixture of beeswax and the slow breath of paper, yet something else lingered, the faint chemical tang of fresh leather, the subtle evidence of recent acquisition that transforms mere collecting into something approaching compulsion. Lewis noticed the pattern first, his methodical eye catching details that might have escaped more casual observation. Nearly half the volumes bore small adhesive labels in one corner, discrete marks embossed with a hair in faint gold, identifying their source as Blackwood Rare Books. The frequency of these acquisitions suggested not the occasional purchase of a discriminating collector, but the systematic accumulation of someone with immediate and pressing needs. A first edition of Scaliger's Poetices sat beside a manuscript copy of Petrarch's Letters, their proximity suggesting not chronological organization, but the random accumulation of someone purchasing whatever became available regardless of coherent collecting principles. On the mantelpiece, a single postcard of Paestum's columns stood propped against a cracked Wedgwood dish, while beside it an open bottle of indifferent claret breathed stubbornly without reward. A record player waited on a low table, a Wagner overture half drawn from its sleeve as though someone had faltered at the thought of that particular grandeur and put the needle back into silence. These details accumulated into a portrait of someone whose authentic love for learning had been shadowed by circumstances that demanded increasingly desperate solutions. Fenwick arrived as we were cataloguing his treasures, his appearance in the doorway, combining academic authority with poorly concealed anxiety. He possessed that particular pallor which develops in those who spend their days among books rather than beneath natural light. Yet something in his manner suggested more specific distress than mere scholarly preoccupation. His hands moved restlessly as he spoke, straightening already ordered papers, adjusting volumes that required no adjustment, the nervous energy of someone struggling to maintain composure under circumstances that demanded careful performance. When confronted with the evidence of his recent acquisitions, his initial response revealed the kind of defensive preparation that suggested he had been anticipating this conversation. He spoke of a small inheritance, a deceased aunt whose estate had provided unexpected resources for indulging his scholarly passions. Yet the details of his explanation seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The careful construction of someone who had practiced his story until it achieved the appearance of truthfulness without actually containing any substantial facts that could be independently verified. Under the quiet, persistent pressure of our questioning, the carefully constructed facade began to reveal its fundamental instability. His hands betrayed him first, a slight tremor when reaching for documents, the way his fingers lingered on certain books as though seeking comfort from familiar textures. When I mentioned the specific amounts reflected on several Blackwood receipts, sums that would strain even a generous inheritance, his composure finally cracked with the brittle sound of something that had been under pressure far too long. The confession emerged in fragments, each admission extracted with the careful patience required when dealing with someone whose shame ran deeper than mere embarrassment. The gambling had begun innocently enough. Casual wagers among colleagues on cricket matches, small stakes poker games in senior common rooms that had gradually escalated into more serious commitment. What had started as academic recreation had transformed into compulsive behavior, the kind of progressive addiction that consumed not merely disposable income, but the fundamental resources necessary for maintaining even modest academic comfort. One has investments, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Family funds, an inheritance. But the words lacked conviction, dissolving into a mumbled confession that revealed a darker, more desperate truth. Racing at Towcester and Stratford, a bookmaker's patience disguised as friendship, a string of small recoverable losses that had developed the odd habit of arriving together. The sums increased by a logic he described without drama, the mathematics of a certain despair. His correspondence, discovered in a desk drawer he had forgotten to lock, revealed the true scope of his desperate situation. These were not love letters, nor desperate pleas for financial assistance, but exchanges with a network of private collectors, wealthy individuals from Europe and America, their names often obscured by initials whose appetites for authenticated Roman manuscripts were as insatiable as their means were vast. Letters from Geneva, from Lugano, from discreet Kensington addresses spoke of extraordinary sums, figures that would have dwarfed his annual stipend many times over. One letter, from a collector identified only as K.V. in Geneva, spoke of particular interest in the Ashcroft fragments, a reference that sent a chill through the afternoon air. The collector was willing to pay a substantial premium for any materials that could be definitively linked to Martin Ashcroft's original research, describing them as historically significant in their controversial provenance. It was an explicit acknowledgement that the scandal surrounding Martin Ashcroft had, rather than diminishing the value of his work, paradoxically enhanced it in the eyes of certain collectors. The language of these exchanges was coded, full of academic euphemisms for what was, at its heart, a sophisticated market for historical artifacts. Phrases had been chosen with forensic care. The ink displays characteristics consistent with. The ductus suggests a trained hand of the late antique period. The palimpsest layer is unusual, but not unparalleled. faceted expressions engineered to pass across borders of conscience and customs alike, creating opportunities for collectors willing to pay extraordinary premiums for immediate access to authenticated materials. Yet for all his financial desperation, for all the evidence pointing to clear motive for potentially interfering with Helena's research, I remained troubled by the genuine grief that still clung to him like a persistent shadow. When I asked about Helena in a way that left him no escape into abstractions, his mouth worked once, twice, then spoke plainly. He had adored her, he said, the word feeling juvenile, but no other would do. He had adored her mind, which was to say, he had adored the woman who possessed it. His description of their final conversation revealed depths of feeling that seemed inconsistent with purely professional collaboration. They had argued not about manuscripts, but about mercy. His word, not mine. Whether exposure of wrongdoing, however justified, could be an act of cruelty when its execution devastated the innocent as well as the guilty. Her answer had been quiet and entire. Truth was not mercy, but the absence of truth was a cruelty even harder to live with. Most significantly, his reaction when I revealed Helena's true identity, her connection to Martin Ashcroft and the decades-old forgery scandal, displayed genuine shock that seemed impossible to feign. The name meant nothing to him, the syllable falling into the room like a coin into water, and I listened for the splash of recognition that never came. His confusion was too clean to be a performance, his bewildered questions about the specifics of the Ashcroft case suggesting someone encountering this information for the first time. She never mentioned a brother, he said with the bewildered tone of someone discovering that familiar landscapes contained hidden geography. Never spoke of family at all, really. I assumed she was simply private about personal matters, the way many academics prefer to maintain professional boundaries. But this changes everything about her research, doesn't it? As evening light faded across the quadrangle, I found myself carrying away multiple threads that seemed to pull in contradictory directions. Fenwick's financial desperation provided clear motive for exploiting Helena's authentication work. Yet, his genuine grief and apparent ignorance of her true identity suggested someone who had been operating without full knowledge of the forces that ultimately led to her death. His correspondence with collectors revealed a network of commercial interests that could have provided compelling reasons for murder, yet the specific timing and method of Helena's death seemed inconsistent with the crude motivations of financial crime. The impressive rare book collection that surrounded us spoke of someone whose love for classical scholarship remained authentic despite his compromised circumstances. Each volume represented not merely a financial transaction, but a genuine appreciation for the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the kind of passionate collecting that transcends mere commercial consideration. Yet the recent acquisitions, the urgent correspondence with collectors, the systematic exploitation of Helena's scholarly reputation, all suggested someone whose authentic passion had been corrupted by circumstances that demanded increasingly desperate solutions. In the gathering dusk, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of classical scholarship, I began to understand that Fenwick represented not the mastermind behind Helena's murder, but rather another victim of the same forces that had ultimately destroyed her. His gambling debts and commercial arrangements had made him vulnerable to manipulation by whoever understood the true stakes involved in Helena's research into the Martin Ashcroft case. A man may be compromised and not be cruel. It is useful to remember this, both for one's cases and for one's peace. The crossword clue that had been haunting my thoughts, Scholar's final transformation, seemed to acquire new resonance in the context of Fenwick's own metamorphosis, from passionate scholar to desperate intermediary. Yet his transformation remained incomplete, his genuine admiration for Helena's brilliance serving as a bridge between his compromised present and his authentic scholarly past. The elegant woman who had left the college grounds with such confident composure, The missing library books, the carefully staged tableau of death, all pointed towards someone who possessed both intimate knowledge of Helena's personal history and the sophisticated understanding necessary to orchestrate her destruction with such meticulous care. The silence of my rooms possessed that particular quality which only the deepest hours of an Oxford night can provide, when even the most restless undergraduates have surrendered to sleep and the ancient stones exhale their accumulated centuries of learning into the darkness. I had returned to Helena's crossword with the persistence of someone who recognizes that truth often hides in the spaces between what we think we understand, carrying it back to my desk where the familiar lamp cast its circle of yellow light across the photocopied grid like a spotlight upon a stage where the final act had yet to be performed. Her handwriting moved across the squares with that careful precision I had come to associate with her scholarly work, each letter formed with deliberate clarity that spoke of a mind accustomed to communicating complex ideas through written symbols. Yet as I studied the completed answers under magnification, patterns emerged that transformed what had initially appeared to be recreational wordplay into something far more deliberate and personally urgent. The thematic consistency was unmistakable once recognized. Metamorphosis stretched across the central horizontal like a spine of meaning, intersecting with transformation in a vertical arrangement that created a cross at the puzzle's heart. Identity occupied a strategic corner position, while deception ran diagonally through several intersecting clues, creating connections that seemed to mirror the complex relationships Helena had been investigating in her final weeks. Other answers carried similar resonance. Forgery in the upper quadrant, betrayal forming part of the left margin, vindication curving through the lower section like a question mark posed to the empty air. This was not mere coincidence, but careful construction, a scholar using the familiar architecture of the cryptic crossword to work through the emotional and intellectual complexities of her research. Helena had been creating a coded meditation on the themes that consumed her final weeks, transforming recreational puzzle solving into a form of scholarly discourse that provided both structure and concealment for thoughts too dangerous to express directly. Yet it was the unsolved clue that held the key to understanding her complete message. Scholar's final transformation, 9, had remained tantalizingly blank, its empty squares seeming to mock my attempts at resolution during those first hours in the library. Now, with the intersecting letters provided by her completed answers, I worked through the possibilities with methodical patience, considering synonyms for change, for ending, for the ultimate fate that awaits all who dedicate their lives to learning. The solution arrived with that quiet satisfaction that accompanies the resolution of long-contemplated problems. Metamorphosis. 9 letters that completed not merely a crossword clue, but a philosophical statement about the nature of scholarly transformation. Helena had chosen the very title of the Ovid passage that lay open beside her in death. The concept that had defined so much of classical literature's approach to change and continuity, the word that now seemed to encompass both her intellectual journey and the terrible metamorphosis that had claimed her life. This recognition compelled me to return to the Ovid itself, the volume we had carefully preserved as evidence, but which I now suspected contained messages more complex than mere scholarly annotation. The book lay open to Book 15 of the Metamorphoses, where Pythagoras discoursed on transformations and the persistence of identity through death. Under the harsh light of my desk lamp, I examined the margins with the kind of careful attention Helena's crossword had taught me to apply, searching for patterns that might have escaped casual observation. The pencil marks were almost imperceptible, faint indentations rather than dark lines, as though pressed with hesitant urgency by someone who understood the dangerous nature of what she was recording. They did not follow the printed text, but moved vertically along the margins, sometimes disappearing into the binding's crease as though seeking concealment, even as they demanded to be preserved. Using a magnifying glass, I traced each faint stroke with the patience of an archaeologist uncovering fragile artifacts. My breath held as letters began to emerge from the pale paper. The message formed itself gradually, like a developing photograph revealing its hidden image. "You killed my brother." The words struck me with the force of accusation long deferred, a silent scream etched into the delicate fabric of ancient text. This was not scholarly annotation, but personal testimony, a statement of absolute certainty written not for general consumption but for a specific, identifiable recipient. Helena had discovered not merely evidence of Martin's innocence, but the precise identity of whoever had orchestrated his destruction. The revelation transformed my understanding of the entire investigation, shifting the landscape with seismic implications that reverberated through everything I thought I had established about motives and methods. The accusation pointed not toward the immediate perpetrator of Helena's murder, but toward the architect of a far older crime, someone whose involvement in Martin Ashcroft's destruction provided compelling reason for preventing Helena's research from reaching completion. This was profoundly personal testimony, the desperate final communication of someone who had confronted her brother's destroyer and chosen to record that knowledge in a format that might survive, even if she did not. The passionate correspondence with M acquired new significance, not romantic entanglement, but something far more complex, perhaps communication with someone she had identified as complicit in Martin's downfall, or even desperate attempts to reach her brother himself if he remained alive somewhere under an assumed identity. I found myself reconsidering each suspect through this new lens of understanding. Professor Hartwell's role in the original investigation, his admission of institutional complicity, his intimate knowledge of Helena's true identity, all provided compelling motives for preventing exposure of his participation in what might have been a deliberate conspiracy. Yet his genuine remorse during our conversations suggested the weight of decades-old guilt rather than immediate fear of criminal prosecution. Dr. Fenwick's financial desperation and commercial arrangements with collectors created clear incentive for exploiting Helena's authentication work, yet his apparent ignorance of her true identity and authentic grief over her death seemed inconsistent with the sophisticated planning required for orchestrating her murder. His transformation from passionate scholar to desperate intermediary represented a different kind of metamorphosis than the one Helena had been investigating. Most intriguingly, Vivian Blackwood's extensive knowledge of Helena's private research, her defensive reactions to questions about missing library books, her sophisticated understanding of manuscript authentication, all suggested someone with both intimate involvement in the events surrounding Martin's original disgrace and compelling reason to prevent Helena's vindication of her brother's reputation. The elegant woman Grimsby had observed leaving the college grounds, the careful timing of the visit, the professional competence with which Helena's death had been staged, all pointed toward someone who combined scholarly sophistication with personal investment in maintaining the fiction that had destroyed Martin Ashcroft's career. Yet even this apparent resolution raised troubling questions about the deeper currents of motivation and method. The hidden message in Ovid represented not merely identification of Martin's destroyer, but evidence of Helena's courage in continuing her investigation, despite growing awareness of personal danger. She had known the risks, had understood that her research threatened someone with both motive and means for preventing its completion, yet she had chosen to pursue truth even at the cost of her own life. The crossword and the marginalia in Ovid represented more than scholarly ingenuity. They constituted moral testimony of the highest order, the determination to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail, even if the seeker did not survive to witness its achievement. Helena's final transformation had been not merely from living scholar to posthumous witness, but from someone who sought truth to someone who became its permanent guardian, leaving behind evidence that would speak when her voice had been silenced. In the gathering quiet of the Oxford night, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, I began to understand that Helena's murder represented the violent conclusion of a decades-long struggle for justice that had consumed 2 generations of the Ashcroft family. The elegant precision with which her death had been orchestrated, the systematic removal of evidence that might have pointed toward specific conclusions, the careful staging that suggested scholarly suicide rather than murder, all indicated a killer who possessed not merely intimate knowledge of Helena's personal history, but sophisticated understanding of the academic world's capacity for both creating and concealing scandal. The message hidden in Ovid's margins, "You killed my brother," now demanded not merely identification of Martin's destroyer, but comprehension of the complex motives that had driven someone to orchestrate both the original conspiracy and Helena's subsequent elimination. The crossword's theme of transformation had proven prophetic, documenting not merely Helena's intellectual journey, but her killer's metamorphosis from scholar to murderer, from someone who created knowledge to someone who destroyed those who threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about the carefully constructed fiction that had become accepted history. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky beyond my windows, I found myself carrying the weight of Helena's final accusation like a sacred trust. The game had entered its concluding phase, where all the careful deceptions and elaborate constructions would finally yield to the persistent pressure of truth. Yet I understood now that the resolution would require not merely identifying the immediate perpetrator, but exposing the entire network of complicity that had made both Martin's destruction and Helena's murder not only possible, but, from the killer's perspective, absolutely necessary. There exists in detective work a particular species of revelation that arrives not with thunderclaps, but through the patient accumulation of whispers, each small inconsistency adding its voice to a chorus that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Lewis possessed that methodical eye which notices the comma out of place in an otherwise perfect sentence, the single note that transforms harmony into discord. When he appeared at my door in the grey hours of morning, carrying a folder with the careful reverence of someone bearing fragile archaeological specimens, I recognized immediately that he had discovered something that would alter the entire landscape of our investigation. The college visitor logs lay spread across my desk like ancient maps whose territories had shifted in the night. These mundane administrative records, initially dismissed as mere bureaucratic routine, now revealed their subtle deceptions under Lewis's forensic scrutiny. The entry documenting the evening of Helena's death showed signs of careful alteration that became apparent only when examined with microscopic attention to detail. "The ink tells its own story," Lewis explained with characteristic precision, his magnifying glass revealing variations invisible to casual observation. "See here. The date has been changed from the 13th to the 14th. The vertical stroke that transforms the 3 into a 4 was added later, using a different pen with ink a fraction warmer in tone. The pressure is different too, more hesitant, as though the hand that made the alteration was working under stress. More significantly, the signature column bore evidence of systematic manipulation. Where a name should have appeared, someone had substituted an elegant dash, accompanied by what appeared to be either a check mark or the letter Vi, executed with deliberate ambiguity. The mark possessed that studied casualness which characterizes deception, too perfect to be accidental, too imprecise to be definitively incriminating. Helena's research notes, recovered from her rooms but initially catalogued as routine scholarly documentation, revealed their own carefully concealed secrets. Among her meticulous annotations on manuscript authentication, Lewis had discovered a page bearing what appeared to be an accidental smudge, a dark mark that obscured a crucial piece of information with suspicious precision. Under chemical analysis, the ghost of Helena's original writing began to emerge like a developing photograph, revealing its hidden image. The obscured text proved devastating. V. Blackwood, contemporary fabrication, systematic deception spanning multiple decades. Helena had not merely suspected Vivian's involvement in manuscript forgery. She had documented it with scholarly precision, creating evidence that would have destroyed the elegant antiquarian's carefully constructed reputation. The smudge represented not careless handling, but deliberate sabotage, an attempt to render crucial conclusions illegible without destroying the surrounding documentation entirely. This microscopic detail compelled me to reconstruct the entire investigation with fresh understanding, recognizing that we had been pursuing not merely a contemporary murder, but the violent conclusion of a decades-long campaign of academic fraud. The pattern began to emerge with terrible clarity. Systematic evidence manipulation that connected Helena's death to her brother's destruction through a web of forged documents, altered records, and carefully orchestrated deceptions. The allegations against Martin Ashcroft in 1973 acquired new and sinister significance in this context. What had appeared to be legitimate scholarly concerns about manuscript authenticity now revealed themselves as deliberately planted evidence, designed to destroy a brilliant young scholar whose innovative authentication techniques threatened to expose ongoing forgery operations. The committee that had condemned Martin had been presented with documentation whose primary strength was its apparent authenticity. Dates that aligned perfectly with institutional records, expert testimonies that corroborated each other with suspicious precision, provenance narratives constructed with the elegant sophistication of someone intimately familiar with academic protocols. Vivian Blackwood's role as respected antiquarian dealer had provided perfect cover for systematic criminal activity spanning multiple decades. Her shop's sophisticated equipment, her extensive network of collectors, her intimate knowledge of manuscript authentication, all had served dual purposes, supporting both legitimate scholarship and the creation of convincing forgeries that could deceive even expert examination. The missing library books from Helena's final evening now revealed their crucial significance. The Suetonius, the Pliny, and the medieval manuscript catalogue had contained evidence that would have supported Helena's conclusions about historical document tampering, creating an independent paper trail that connected past and present crimes. The anonymous note that had first alerted us to Helena's absence acquired chilling new meaning as a piece of calculated misdirection. Its precise wording, its lack of genuine urgency, its function as stage direction rather than concerned warning, all suggested someone who understood the importance of controlling not merely the crime scene, but the initial parameters of the investigation. The elegant woman Grimsby had observed leaving the college grounds with such confident composure now revealed her identity with devastating clarity. Dr. Fenwick's financial desperation and commercial arrangements with collectors suddenly appeared as symptoms rather than causes, evidence of systematic exploitation by someone who understood both his weaknesses and his access to Helena's authentication work. His genuine grief over her death, his apparent ignorance of her true identity as Martin's sister. These details now suggested someone who had been manipulated rather than corrupted, used as an unwitting intermediary, while the real architect of the conspiracy maintained careful distance from direct involvement. Professor Hartwell's role in the original investigation against Martin acquired tragic dimensions in this new understanding. His genuine remorse during our conversations reflected not criminal guilt, but the anguish of someone who had been systematically deceived, whose trust in documentary evidence and expert testimony had been exploited to destroy an innocent scholar. His support for Helena's work, despite knowing her true identity, represented personal atonement for unwitting participation in her brother's academic annihilation. The passionate correspondence Helena had maintained with the mysterious M now revealed its true significance. Not romantic entanglement, but something far more poignant. A sister's desperate attempt to communicate with a brother whose life had been systematically destroyed. Whether Martin remained alive somewhere under an assumed identity, or whether Helena had been writing to his memory, the letters represented a decades-long quest for vindication that had finally brought her back to confront the architect of the original injustice. The crossword puzzle from Helena's final evening, with its themes of transformation, identity, and vindication had proven prophetic in ways she might not have fully anticipated. Her hidden message in the Ovid margins, "You killed my brother," represented not merely identification of Martin's destroyer, but evidence of her courage in continuing the investigation, despite growing awareness of personal danger. She had known the risks, had understood that her research threatened someone with both motive and means for preventing its completion, yet she had chosen to pursue truth even at the cost of her own life. As dawn broke across Oxford's ancient spires, I found myself carrying the weight of systematic deception that had consumed 2 generations of brilliant scholars. The fading ink in visitor logs and research notes represented more than simple evidence tampering. They constituted the final, desperate attempts of someone who had built an entire career upon lies to prevent the truth from finally emerging into daylight. The elegant precision with which Helena's death had been orchestrated, the symbolic arrangement of books and personal effects, the careful removal of evidence that might have exposed historical manipulations, all pointed toward someone who possessed not merely intimate knowledge of Helena's personal history, but sophisticated understanding of the academic world's capacity for both creating and concealing scandal. Vivian Blackwood had transformed scholarship from the pursuit of truth into an instrument of systematic destruction, creating a criminal enterprise that had flourished for decades beneath the civilized veneer of antiquarian dealing. The microscopic details Lewis had discovered, altered dates, suspicious smudges, variations in ink composition, had revealed the architecture of deception that connected Martin's destruction to Helena's murder, creating a pattern of criminal behavior that demanded not merely justice but comprehensive exposure of the institutional vulnerabilities that had made such systematic fraud possible. In the gathering light of morning, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, I began to prepare for the final confrontation with someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of scholarly deception, transforming the noble pursuit of knowledge into a weapon for destroying those who threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about the carefully constructed fiction that had become accepted history. The bell above Vivian Blackwood's door sounded like a private cough, as though even brass preferred discretion in that hushed sanctuary where centuries of accumulated learning had been transformed into carefully priced commodities. The afternoon light fell through leaded windows with particular intensity, illuminating dust motes that danced like microscopic accusations in the air between us. I had asked Lewis to wait outside, not from any concern for my safety, but from recognition that whatever dignity remained to Vivian Blackwood deserved the privacy that confession, however belated, demands from those who witness its unfolding. She stood behind her polished counter with the stillness of someone who had been expecting this moment far longer than either of us cared to acknowledge. Her silver hair caught the pale light with its customary elegance, her posture radiating that particular form of composed authority that had served her so well in academic circles for more than 2 decades. Yet something in her eyes, a flicker of resignation, perhaps, or the terrible relief that comes when elaborate deceptions finally approach their inevitable conclusion, suggested that the woman who had orchestrated such sophisticated crimes was prepared, at last, to account for them. I laid the evidence before her with methodical precision, each piece a fragment in the mosaic of systematic deception we had finally assembled. Helena's research notes, their chemically revealed text exposing the accusation Vivian had tried so desperately to obscure. V. Blackwood, contemporary fabrication, systematic deception spanning multiple decades. The college visitor logs with their telltale alterations, dates changed by a hand that had grown unsteady under pressure. The 3 missing library books, their very presence now a refutation of the carefully staged absence that had greeted us in the rare books room. And finally, the photocopied page from Ovid, its margins bearing Helena's desperate, accusing message, "You killed my brother." Her initial response revealed the instincts of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of scholarly discourse. She spoke of circumstantial evidence, of the regrettable tendency of official inquiries to transform academic disagreements into criminal conspiracies, of the tragic loss of a brilliant colleague whose work had perhaps led her into emotional territories beyond her capacity to navigate safely. Her voice remained steady, a cultivated instrument of reason, yet I noticed the subtle tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible tremor in hands that had arranged so many careful deceptions. "These are fragments, Inspector," she began with that dismissive precision that had served her so well in professional disputes. "Isolated details that, when viewed through the lens of suspicion, can be made to suggest any number of fanciful narratives. Dr. Ashworth's research, while promising, was often speculative. Her enthusiasm sometimes outran her scholarly judgment. Yet the weight of accumulated evidence, presented with Lewis's quiet persistence and my own patient reconstruction of her crimes, began to tell its inexorable story. I described Albert Grimsby's recollection of her departure from the college grounds, the elegant coat, the confident stride, the distinctive scent of beeswax and old paper that marked her as surely as a signature. I spoke of the precise timing of her visit, calibrated to coincide with Helena's final hours, and the ritualistic staging of the crime scene designed to suggest scholarly suicide rather than deliberate murder. It was the sight of the library books, returned now to bear witness against her, that finally shattered the elegant facade she had maintained for so long. Her composure cracked with the brittle sound of something that had been under pressure far too long, and the careful mask of academic indignation slipped to reveal deeper, more complex emotions. Not fear, precisely, but a cold, desperate resolve mixed with something that might have been relief. She picked up the medieval manuscript catalogue with fingers that moved like those of someone greeting an old lover returned from a long journey. When she spoke again, her voice carried different qualities, not the measured tones of professional defense, but the raw honesty of someone who had finally grown weary of maintaining elaborate lies. "Martin," she whispered, the name a ghost in the quiet air of her shop. "He was extraordinary, you know. Far more brilliant than any of them gave him credit for. A true visionary, ahead of his time. He saw connections others missed, understood the language of ancient texts in ways that transcended mere translation. He recognized patterns of systematic forgery that had been accepted as authentic scholarship for generations. The confession emerged then, not in dramatic bursts, but through the patient unraveling of a story that had been carefully suppressed for more than 20 years. She had been Martin Ashcroft's lover in the early 1970s, drawn to his intellectual fire, his revolutionary theories, his passionate disregard for academic orthodoxy. Their affair had burned with intensity that matched his scholarship, a clandestine dance of intellect and intimacy played out in Oxford's hidden corners. "I was young then," she continued with something approaching genuine emotion, "ambitious, building the connections that would sustain my career. Martin's work was becoming too dangerous, threatening to expose entire collections as fraudulent, challenging reputations that had been built over decades. When our relationship ended, badly, as such things often do, I felt not merely abandoned, but betrayed by his refusal to consider the broader implications of his research. The systematic destruction of Martin's career had required intimate knowledge of his methods, his vulnerabilities, his absolute commitment to scholarly truth. Vivian had planted forged evidence among his research materials with surgical precision. Subtle alterations to documents he was studying, expert testimonies from European colleagues who had been deceived about the true nature of certain manuscripts, a paper trail that seemed to confirm the anonymous accusations that had begun circulating among senior faculty. It was not malicious, she insisted with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades justifying her actions to herself. Martin was naive about academic politics, convinced that truth would always prevail over institutional convenience. His theories, if left unchecked, would have brought down so many innocent scholars whose only crime was accepting established attributions. I merely, expedited a process that was, in many ways, inevitable. Helena's arrival at St. Bartholomew's, her quiet, methodical research into the very manuscript fragments that had been central to Martin's disgrace, had represented an existential threat to the carefully constructed edifice of Vivian's life. Helena's authentication work was proving Martin's long-dismissed theories correct, validating insights that had been branded as fraudulent fantasy, exposing the sophisticated network of deception that had operated beneath the civilized veneer of academic scholarship for decades. She was so like him, Vivian observed with a smile that mixed admiration and regret, that same unwavering conviction, that dangerous pursuit of truth without regard for consequences. She would have exposed everything, not just Martin's innocence, but my role in his destruction. My reputation, my livelihood, everything I had built over 40 years would have been reduced to ashes. The decision to murder Helena had been made with the cold logic of someone facing complete annihilation. The library meeting had been arranged under the pretense of scholarly collaboration, a final review of authentication progress. Vivian knew Helena's habits, her preference for solitude among rare books, her trust in colleagues who shared her passion for classical texts. The digitalis, administered through evening tea, represented a choice that reflected both her botanical knowledge and her desire for a death that would suggest natural causes or scholarly despair. There was no struggle, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the shop's walls. Helena spoke with the steadiness of someone who had finished a difficult race. She knew, I think, what was coming. The Ovid lay ready because she had opened it herself. I merely arranged things afterward. Removed the books that would have supported her conclusions, altered the visitor log, walked home through rain that seemed to wash away the immediate evidence of what I had done. As her confession concluded, the silence in the shop returned, but it was different now, heavy with the weight of decades of deception, of brilliant lives destroyed by jealousy and calculated cruelty. Vivian Blackwood stood before us not as the elegant antiquarian who had charmed Oxford's academic community, but as the architect of a double tragedy whose sophistication had nearly prevented its detection. In that hushed sanctuary, surrounded by centuries of accumulated wisdom, I found myself contemplating the terrible irony of her crimes. She had transformed the noble pursuit of knowledge into an instrument of destruction, using her intimate understanding of scholarly methods to create the very forgeries she claimed to oppose. The dust motes that danced in afternoon light seemed to whisper of secrets buried and truths finally emerging, of the patient way justice sometimes works, through the accumulated weight of small revelations. "Dust is a kind of absolution," she said suddenly, as though reading my thoughts, "until someone opens the window." Her words carried the weight of someone who had lived with guilt for 30 years, who had built an entire identity around maintaining elaborate deceptions, who now faced the terrible clarity that comes when carefully constructed lies finally collapse under their own accumulated weight. As Lewis stepped forward with the warrant, Vivian requested only that the lights be turned off in the back room where her microscopes glowed like small moons. In the gathering dimness, surrounded by volumes whose titles disappeared into shadow, she asked whether I believed justice and truth were the same shape. I told her that in Oxford they often dressed alike and borrowed each other's umbrellas, but that truth, however painful, was ultimately more merciful than the lies we construct to protect ourselves from its demands. The rain had begun again as we left her shop, that fine persistence which seemed to dissolve the edges of the ancient city, blurring the lines between past and present, between crimes committed and justice finally served. In my pocket, I carried the weight of a confession that would travel through statements and charge sheets, losing heat with each retelling. Yet in that quiet room, it had felt like winter sun on the wrist, brief, undeniable, and somehow cleansing in its terrible honesty. The crossword clue that had haunted Helena's final evening, Scholar's final transformation, had proven prophetic in ways none of us could have anticipated. The metamorphosis it described encompassed not merely academic discovery, but the fundamental change that comes when buried truths finally surface to demand their due from those who thought their secrets safely buried in the accumulated dust of centuries. The afternoon light in Vivian Blackwood's shop had acquired that particular quality of finality which arrives when long-held secrets prepare to surrender themselves to daylight. Lewis had withdrawn to a respectful distance near the door, understanding that what we were witnessing required the privacy that true confessions demand. Not the theatrical declarations of guilt that populate courtrooms, but the quiet unraveling of a soul that had spent 30 years perfecting the architecture of deception. The bell above the entrance had fallen silent, as though even brass recognized the solemnity of the moment. And in that hushed sanctuary, where centuries of accumulated wisdom had been transformed into carefully priced commodities, Vivian prepared to account for crimes that had defined the better part of her adult life. She moved among her treasures with the deliberate grace of someone bidding farewell to lifelong companions, her hands trailing across familiar spines with unconscious affection. The confession had drained something essential from her elegant bearing, yet what remained carried a different kind of authority, the terrible honesty of someone who had finally grown weary of maintaining elaborate lies, yet remained convinced of their fundamental necessity. Her voice, when she began to speak, possessed the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in solitude for decades, each detail polished by repetition until it achieved the appearance of inevitability. There was no remorse in her tone, not the absence of emotion, but something deeper and more troubling, the settled conviction of someone who had made peace with choices that others would find unforgivable. The digitalis was remarkably simple to obtain, she began with clinical detachment, her gaze fixed on a small herbarium folio that lay open on the side table. A pressed foxglove occupied 2 leaves, secured with paper slips whose paste had darkened to the color of old tea. Someone had written Digitalis Purpurea in tidy italic script that tried not to be proud of itself. My own garden provided the source. Foxglove is common enough, beautiful in its purple bells, yet deadly when properly prepared. Martin had written extensively about botanical knowledge in classical texts, their sophisticated understanding of natural toxins. He found it poetic that something so lovely could be so efficiently lethal. She described the extraction process with scholarly precision, the careful preparation of leaves and flowers in a small mortar that still sat beside her inkstand, its rim bearing faint traces of granular dust like pale memory. The poison had been reduced to fine powder, then dissolved in honey until it disappeared into sweetness, a technique that required both botanical knowledge and the patience of someone accustomed to working with delicate materials. Helena trusted me completely, Vivian continued, her hands resting lightly on the glass counter. We had collaborated for months, shared discoveries, debated theoretical approaches with the enthusiasm of scholars who had found intellectual kinship. When I suggested meeting in the library to review her final conclusions, she accepted without hesitation. She was excited, actually, convinced she had assembled definitive proof of Martin's innocence, eager to share evidence that would vindicate her brother's reputation posthumously. The tea had been prepared in her own thermos, brought to the library under the pretense of thoughtful hospitality. Earl Grey provided ideal camouflage, the bergamot oil masking any residual bitterness, the familiar ritual of shared refreshment creating an atmosphere of scholarly collegiality that made suspicion impossible. Helena had consumed it while discussing her research with characteristic enthusiasm, describing the connections she had discovered between Martin's original theories and the manuscript fragments currently under authentication. She spoke beautifully about Martin in those final minutes, Vivian observed with something that might have been satisfaction. described him as someone who had been ahead of his time, whose insights about systematic forgery in classical manuscripts would eventually be recognized as revolutionary. She was convinced that exposing the truth about his case would transform our understanding of academic fraud, create new protocols for authentication that would prevent similar injustices. Such dangerous naivety. The poison worked with gentle efficiency, creating the appearance of someone who had simply fallen asleep over her scholarly work. Vivienne had positioned the Ovid with deliberate symbolism, ensuring it remained open to passages about transformation and the persistence of identity through death. The crossword puzzle was left precisely as Helena had completed it, its themes of metamorphosis and vindication serving as unwitting epitaph for someone whose quest for justice had ultimately cost her life. I removed the 3 library books she had been studying, Vivienne continued with matter-of-fact precision. The Suetonius contained marginalia from the 1970s that would have supported her conclusions about document tampering. The Pliny included references to authentication techniques that Martin had pioneered. The medieval catalogue documented acquisitions that contradicted official provenance narratives. Together, they constituted a paper trail that would have exposed not just my role in Martin's destruction, but the entire network of systematic deception that had flourished beneath Oxford's civilized veneer. I noticed the canvas bag hanging from a brass hook near the till, its college crest almost erased by rain and habit, the seam carrying stowaway grit the color of library dust. That same grit had been present in the joint of Helena's reading desk, a microscopic testament to the book's journey from library to shop and back again. The alteration of the visitor log had been accomplished with practiced ease, a different pen, warmer ink, the hesitant pressure of someone working under stress to create plausible deniability while maintaining official documentation. Yet even in confession, Vivienne maintained the fundamental justifications that had sustained her through decades of guilt and careful concealment. She spoke of Martin with a mixture of admiration and contempt that revealed the complex emotions underlying their relationship and its violent conclusion. He had been brilliant, she acknowledged, perhaps the most gifted classical scholar of his generation, yet his refusal to consider the broader implications of his research had represented a form of intellectual arrogance that demanded correction. Martin was weak in the ways that matter most, she declared with cold precision. He possessed extraordinary technical abilities but lacked the emotional resilience necessary for navigating academic politics. His theories about systematic forgery, while ultimately correct, would have destroyed innocent scholars whose only crime was accepting established attributions. He refused to understand that truth, however academically pure, carries social responsibilities that sometimes require moderation. Helena, in her analysis, had inherited her brother's dangerous naivety, his unwavering conviction that scholarly integrity transcended all other considerations. Her authentication work had been methodically sound, her conclusions about the manuscript fragments scientifically valid, yet she had approached her research with the same disregard for consequences that had characterized Martin's career. Some secrets justify any price to preserve them, Vivienne declared with calm certainty. The academic world depends upon trust, upon the assumption that established scholars operate with integrity and competence. Exposing the extent of historical document tampering would have undermined confidence in entire fields of study, destroyed the reputations of colleagues who had been deceived rather than complicit, created chaos that would have taken generations to resolve. Her words carried the weight of someone who had transformed criminal self-interest into philosophical principle, who had convinced herself that murder represented not personal preservation, but institutional protection. The elegant rationalization revealed depths of self-deception that were perhaps more disturbing than simple greed or jealousy. Someone who had corrupted not merely her professional practices, but her fundamental understanding of right and wrong. As Lewis moved forward with quiet efficiency, handcuffs glinting briefly before disappearing into the unremarkable shape duty requires, Vivian asked only that we leave the back room lamps off. In the dimness, her microscopes looked like patient meditations, waiting for hands that would never return to continue their careful work of authentication and, when necessary, sophisticated deception. Walking back through rain that smelled of stone and leaves, I found myself contemplating what survives of love when it has been corrupted by pride and fear. Not the declarations. Those are the first to spoil. Not even the acts, which lose their angles in the washing. What endures is what gets carried forward unbeautifully. The stubborn detail, the remembered habit, the ridiculous refusal to forget. Helena had left a pencil's pressure in Ovid that would outlast my pension. Martin had survived in the shape of his sister's questions. Vivian, who had loved him in a way that made ruin seem reasonable, had chosen reputation over truth and called it necessary. Oxford, that old librarian, would keep the story with its usual courtesies. The catalogue would be amended, the errata engaged. A few portraits would be moved to shadier walls. Students would copy out passages that had learned to behave. Somewhere a foxglove would open its purple bells on a hill far from any library, and neither flower nor observer would trouble themselves with Latin names or their deadly implications. In the gathering darkness, I understood that Vivian Blackwood's confession represented not merely the resolution of a murder case, but the exposure of something far more troubling, the capacity of human intelligence to transform love into hatred, scholarship into fraud, the noble pursuit of knowledge into an instrument of systematic destruction. What survived of love in her carefully constructed world was not passion or devotion, but something colder and more calculating. The desperate need to preserve the fiction that had become her truth, regardless of the cost in human lives. Winter had settled over Oxford with that particular authority which transforms the ancient city into something approaching its essential self, each morning striking colder and more resonant than the last. I found myself walking once more through St. Bartholomew's quadrangles, the bare branches of ancient trees sketching skeletal patterns against a sky the color of unwashed pewter, my footsteps creating the first tracks across courtyards where snow had fallen during the night with the precision of someone shelving books in a familiar library. The air carried that crystalline quality which makes distant sounds seem closer and immediate ones strangely muffled, as though the entire university were holding its breath in contemplation of truths recently revealed and justice finally, imperfectly served. The college had performed its liturgy of aftermath with punctilious grace. Vivian Blackwood's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with the kind of measured justice that the British legal system provides when confronted with crimes of unusual sophistication. She had been sentenced to life imprisonment for Helena's murder. Her elegant composure maintained even as the verdict transformed her from respected antiquarian into convicted killer. The evidence Lewis and I had assembled, the altered visitor logs, the chemical analysis of Helena's research notes, the systematic documentation of decades-old manuscript fraud, had proven sufficient to establish not merely her guilt in Helena's death, but her role in orchestrating Martin Ashcroft's academic destruction 30 years earlier. A memorial service for Helena had been held beneath those pale, thoughtful windows of the college chapel. Hartwell read a piece from Pindar in a voice that nearly remembered youth before the vowels failed him, his hands performing the choreography of regret with unconscious grace. In the front pew, I watched the registrar, no longer young and perhaps more human for it, who would later amend Martin's file with the delicacy of someone binding a child's wound. The inch-long notation that had defined a life, withdrawn allegations, was replaced by a sentence that did its best to be modest. Exonerated by subsequent evidence. Research vindicated. The manuscripts themselves, those stubborn fragments that had lured so many minds into their honeyed dangers, would bear Martin Ashcroft's name in the next catalogue. The academic press had added a preface acknowledging the courage of scholars whose labor had outlasted them by other means. their names forever linked with the texts they had died to authenticate and preserve. It was a small monument, perhaps, carved from the wreckage of 2 lives, yet it seemed inadequate when measured against the human costs of the deceptions that had made such violence seem necessary. Professor Hartwell received me in his study with the weary resignation of someone who had been expecting this conversation for many years, though now it carried the weight of concluded rather than pending revelation. His role in the original investigation against Martin had acquired tragic dimensions in light of Vivian's confession. Not criminal guilt, but the anguish of someone who had been systematically deceived, whose trust in documentary evidence and expert testimony had been exploited to destroy an innocent scholar. His support for Helena's work, despite knowing her true identity, had represented personal atonement for unwitting participation in her brother's academic annihilation. Dr. Fenwick's rooms had been reduced to their syllables, the college movers stacking his books in sober towers and leaving gaps on the walls where learning had sat like a well-behaved guest. His collectors, those initials that had once sounded like a foreign alphabet of privilege, ceased writing when the newspapers printed Vivian's name. His debts, lacking moral imagination, remained exactly themselves. On his desk, we had found a list of evening classes in Italian, which struck me as a gesture at a different kind of poverty. He had been compromised, certainly, but not cruel, a distinction that mattered more than legal categories might suggest. Walking through the college gardens where winter had reduced elaborate plantings to their essential structures, I found myself contemplating the relationship between truth and justice that Helena's case had illuminated in such troubling ways. Her death had exposed Vivian's crimes and restored Martin's reputation, yet it seemed impossible to claim that justice had been served when the pursuit of truth had cost 2 lives and destroyed a 3rd. The elegant symmetry of legal resolution, crime committed, evidence gathered, punishment administered, felt inadequate when confronted with the persistent reality that understanding and belonging might be mutually exclusive aspirations. I paused beneath the ancient yew where Fenwick and I had first discussed Helena's research, its branches now bearing a delicate tracery of snow that would disappear with the morning sun. The tree had witnessed centuries of Oxford's academic dramas, yet for all its longevity, it could offer no wisdom about the fundamental questions Helena's case had raised. Truth and justice, those ostensible twins, remained like well-brought-up cousins who exchange umbrellas and letters, but sleep in different houses. The rare books room remained closed for renovation, a euphemism that allowed the college to address the psychological residue of violent death while maintaining the scholarly fiction that learning could continue unmarked by the human frailties that occasionally intruded upon its pursuit. Yet I knew that the oak table where Helena had been found remained in its accustomed place, waiting with patient dignity for the return of scholars who would never know the tragedy it had witnessed. In my study that evening, I placed Helena's unfinished crossword beside a glass of something which, like many consolations, arrived under false pretenses and performed about half its promises. Scholars' final transformation had been answered with devastating completeness, but the last visitor came without a name, remained tantalizingly blank. I allowed myself the small superstition of leaving it so, recognizing that some mysteries preserve their dignity through remaining unsolved. What had been restored? A reputation, which is to say a history revised as carefully as it had once been falsified. What had been lost? A living mind, a voice that would have been worth hearing, a particular way of understanding ancient texts that made even Lewis appreciate the classics for a moment. Helena had purchased her brother's name with her life, a transaction no sane shop would recommend, though she would not have put it that way. She would have spoken of integrity and the scholarly record, of the terrible necessity of truth regardless of its consequences. The academic world had responded to these revelations with characteristic caution. establishing new protocols for manuscript authentication while carefully avoiding any comprehensive examination of how systematic fraud had flourished undetected for so many decades. Oxford, that patient librarian, would catalogue this story with its usual discretion, filing it among the countless human dramas that had played out within its walls over 8 centuries. The portraits in college halls would continue to gaze down with painted serenity upon future generations of scholars, offering no warning about the dangers of pursuing truth without considering its consequences. As the evening light faded with that particular Oxford quality that seems filtered through centuries of scholarship, I found myself carrying away not resolution, but a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human motivation and the inadequacy of simple moral categories. The secrets that lay hidden beneath even the most ordered existence were not merely the stuff of criminal investigations, but the very fabric of human experience, the tender details we would rather be mocked than reveal, the kindnesses we misremember as policy, the stray dislikes that persist when principle has packed its bag. In the gathering darkness, I wondered about the enduring ache of understanding without truly belonging that seemed to characterize so much of academic life, so much of my own professional existence. Each case added its weight to larger questions that had no final answers, contributing to a kind of practical wisdom that accepted human complexity without demanding moral certainty. What remained was memory, imperfect, selective, but persistent in its refusal to allow the dead to disappear entirely into the comfortable abstractions that history provides. The snow continued to fall as I prepared to leave Oxford's narrow streets, each flake finding its designated place in the accumulating whiteness that would transform the ancient city overnight. Somewhere across town, a bicycle passed with that faint sibilance which in Oxford serves as a unit of time. The weight of memory settled around my shoulders like an old coat, familiar and somehow comforting in its persistent reminder that understanding, however incomplete, remained preferable to the comfortable fictions we construct to protect ourselves from truth's more demanding requirements.